Thomas Granville had learned to live with noise. The rustling of cameras, the hum of distant gossip, the endless echo of curated praise, all of it had become the backdrop of his life in California. The sharp lines of Montecito's perfection framed his days with sun-drenched clarity, yet there was something missing in the warmth. He felt it most acutely in the quiet moments, while pouring his morning tea, while fastening his cufflinks, while standing alone on the balcony after everyone had gone to sleep. Those were the moments when the silence spoke the loudest, and it always spoke of home. It began with little things. One morning he opened a drawer looking for an old watch and found a folded photograph from his 20s, taken on the back steps of his family's country estate in Sussex. His brother, Henry, had an arm thrown around him, both laughing at something long forgotten. Dust coated the edges of the picture. He brushed it off with his thumb and stared for longer than he intended. That same week, his cousin Jasper called. Unexpectedly, the two hadn't spoken in months, maybe more. Jasper's voice was subdued, more frail than Thomas remembered. The words came slowly. Diagnosis, treatment, nothing terminal yet. But serious enough that Thomas felt the floor shift under his feet. That night, he wandered the house aimlessly, passing Eleanor's office where the glow of a ring light spilled out beneath the door. She was recording a podcast again, laughing brightly into the lens of a future she had constructed with both hands. Thomas didn't interrupt. He turned instead toward the library and pulled out a heavy volume he hadn't touched in years, a collection of essays on monarchy, legacy, and tradition. Inside the front cover, scribbled in his grandfather's angular script, were the words, "Know where you came from. It's where you'll return when all else falls away." He closed the book gently and walked out to the terrace. The sky was clear, but it felt far away. The palm trees no longer stirred him. He imagined instead the narrow roads of Surrey, the way the fog settled against the hedgerows, the sound of gravel beneath a leather sole. The memory was not nostalgic. It was hungry. It wanted him back. For days after, he tried to ignore it. He dove into foundation work, joined Eleanor for filming, attended charity dinners with perfectly delivered smiles. But the ache lingered, blooming behind his ribs. He began looking at flights when no one was watching. He emailed an old school friend and asked what life was like on the ground. He even called his father's assistant, asking casually about events he might attend, if he were ever back in the country. And then, one afternoon, as Eleanor paced their kitchen rehearsing a monologue for her next appearance, Thomas opened his laptop and booked a one-way ticket to London. He didn't tell her that night. He didn't know how. All he knew was that something inside him had shifted, not a decision, but a return to something that had never really let him go. Eleanor sat across from Thomas at the kitchen table, one hand wrapped around a half-drunk cup of tea gone cold. He was speaking, his tone calm but resolute, laying out a plan she hadn't expected to be real. He spoke of schools in Surrey, of a cottage not far from Windsor, of reconnecting with family and re-establishing what he called roots. She blinked slowly, trying to find where the joke ended, but there was no trace of performance in his eyes. He had already booked the flight. He had already begun. She leaned back slightly, as if the distance might dull the blow, but it didn't. It sank into her chest like slow-setting cement. At first, she responded the way she had been trained to in Hollywood, with gentle questions and agreeable nods. She mentioned their schedule, the children, the production deal still pending approval. She reminded him, casually, that Los Angeles wasn't just a home, it was a platform. But Thomas wasn't trying to hear her logic. He wasn't looking for approval. He had moved beyond asking Dot over the next week. She watched him morph. He walked with a different pace, slower, more measured. His phone calls increased, first with his brother, then with a trusted aide from the palace who used to handle his logistics. In the evenings, he sat on the patio and scrolled through property listings. Once, she walked past his study and saw him on a video call with a headmaster from a school in the home counties, asking about enrollment deadlines and student-to-teacher ratios. The sound of it made her stomach turn. Eleanor tried not to panic, but the reality was unavoidable. He wanted to go back. And not just to visit. He wanted to return to the very world they had sacrificed everything to leave behind. For her, England meant tight corridors of judgment, faces that smiled with teeth clenched, newspapers that printed apologies in tiny fonts after destroying lives in bold. She had built a new self from the ashes of that place, and now he was asking her to return. With him, or worse, without him, she began sleeping less. Her calls with agents turned longer, sharper. She signed off on a new pilot project without hesitation. In every decision, she leaned harder into her version of the future. She started visiting the city more often, using networking events as a shield from the domestic stillness that now felt like waiting. When Thomas left for his trip to London, officially to attend a charity gala, unofficially to scout homes, she kissed him goodbye with a smile so smooth it felt manufactured. While he was away, she ignored the silence. She filled the house with motion, meetings, fittings, photo shoots, contractors. When his emails arrived, she read them but didn't reply. When he called, she let it ring twice before answering. And when he returned, stepping back into their Montecito home with a look of soft determination on his face, she pretended not to notice the pamphlet sticking out of his satchel, the one with a Windsor postal code printed in bold. Later that night, she found it lying on the coffee table. A folder thick with maps and notes, school brochures, property evaluations. She didn't touch it. She left it there for 2 days before moving it to the drawer beneath the couch. It didn't disappear, but it no longer sat in the open. And then she began making her own folder, one with a very different set of addresses. From the outside, everything still shimmered. Thomas and Eleanor Granville maintained the choreography of unity, shared appearances at charity galas, hand-in-hand moments during photo ops, carefully edited family portraits released on carefully chosen days. Their smiles were intact, their rhythm practiced, their image unbroken. But within the walls of their Montecito estate, silence had become the loudest sound. Thomas had grown distant without meaning to. His mind was back in England more often than in California. He began rising early, taking calls in the conservatory while the house still slept. Eleanor noticed the change not in words but in omissions. The plans he no longer included her in, the way he spoke about stability and heritage without glancing in her direction. He made decisions as if he had already moved. And perhaps in some invisible way, he had. Eleanor responded by turning inward. She immersed herself in her work with a renewed, almost aggressive energy. Every offer was considered. Every meeting became urgent. She extended her team, restructured her foundation, and added new names to her personal PR list. While Thomas imagined a slower life, she accelerated. While he sought old roots, she grew new ones in faster soil. The more he reached backward, the more she sprinted forward, away from the England that had once nearly broken her. They still shared space, still passed each other in the hallway, exchanged pleasantries over breakfast, tucked the children in together. But those moments had become surface-level, gentle performances. Neither spoke of the folders anymore. His was still buried in the drawer beneath the coffee table. Hers, filled with Los Angeles addresses, business proposals, potential production. Partners sat zipped inside her desk, unseen and untouched by him. Publicly, they played their parts with perfection. At a recent gala, they stood on stage, speaking about unity and transformation. Eleanor's voice was radiant, her hand resting softly on Thomas's arm. He smiled, nodded, echoed her points, laughed at her timing. Cameras clicked like metronomes. But beneath the flash, their eyes never really met. One evening, Thomas returned from a walk to find Eleanor hosting a dinner for Hollywood executives in the garden. The air smelled of citrus and ambition. Her laughter carried across the hedges. Like applause. He stood for a moment behind a curtain, watching her, confident, commanding, entirely at home. He turned away before she saw him, retreating to his study where his old passport sat beside a glass of untouched scotch. That night, they went to bed at the same time but slept facing opposite walls. Neither had spoken about the move in weeks. But the path had begun to fork silently, steadily. Each of them was building a future, one rooted in memory, the other in momentum. The house remained full, yet something vital had slipped between the spaces like light through fractured glass. Final choice never arrived with a confrontation. There was no dramatic declaration, no ultimatum hurled across the table, no late-night shouting match to end it all. Instead, the end came the way distance often does, softly, invisibly, until it was simply undeniable. Thomas and Eleanor Granville drifted, not because of resentment, but because they had begun orbiting different truths. It began with his extended absence. What was meant to be a 10-day trip to England for a round of philanthropic engagements quietly stretched into 3 weeks. During that time, Thomas visited 2 potential properties, both surrounded by hedgerows and still air. He met with Jasper. Again, spent an afternoon walking through the school grounds where he hoped his children would one day run, and reconnected with faces from a life that had once felt suffocating but now offered quiet certainty. Back in Montecito, Eleanor didn't wait by the phone. She signed the final contract on her next production, launched a new initiative under her foundation's brand, and hosted a pair of interviews that trended for days. She was photographed often, styled perfectly, praised widely. Alone, she flourished. But every night, when the house emptied and the cameras dimmed, she sat for a moment longer in the living room, surrounded by framed smiles that felt slightly outdated. When Thomas returned, they greeted each other like old friends at a train station, warm, familiar, but not quite tethered. He moved through the house differently now, picking up the children with a tenderness that Eleanor recognized but no longer felt responsible for. In the evenings, they still shared the same space, but each drifted to their separate corners. He to books and quiet, she to calls and light. They no longer spoke of the move. Neither pushed, neither resisted. And yet, in their actions, the decision was already living and breathing. Thomas began preparing for dual residency. He enrolled the children in a London preparatory program under the pretense of keeping options open. Eleanor leased a city flat in Beverly Hills to shorten her commute. Staff began receiving 2 separate schedules. Invitations were updated to Mr. Granville and Ms. Granville, not the Granvilles. Despite the deepening divide, there was no cruelty between them. They exchanged soft words at school functions, still laughed at shared memories, still smiled when they passed in the hall. But those smiles were acknowledgments, not connections like nods across a finish line neither of them had meant to cross. Alone, one evening, as they sat opposite each other in the garden, the silence between them was thicker than the breeze. Eleanor reached for her wine. Thomas looked toward the sky. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The future was already happening, shaped by decisions they had made in quiet rooms, shaped by the lives they were building apart but never completely. Without each other, it wasn't an end. It wasn't even a break. It was something else, an understanding forged from fatigue, love, and time. They had chosen their paths not in opposition, but in parallel. And now, as the garden lights flickered, on one by one, they sat beneath them as 2 people no longer waiting to agree.